On my birthday, my rich grandpa smiled. "How do you spend your $3,400,000 trust fund?" I shockingly blinked. "What trust fund?" My parents looked like they might throw up. He turned to them and asked, "Where did it go?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a guillotine blade hanging in the air. For 26 years, I thought I was the family failure. In 1 second, I realized I was the family bank. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The fork in my mother's hand didn't just stop, it froze, suspended halfway to her mouth like a glitch in a video recording. My father, Brian, usually the loudest man in any room, looked like he'd been struck by lightning while standing in a puddle. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint right into his $400 lobster bisque. I looked around the room. The Winnetka dining room was a masterpiece of intimidation: high ceilings, crystal chandeliers that cost more than my entire college education, and a draft that chilled you to the bone, no matter how high the heating bill was. I was sitting there in a thrifted blazer I'd bought for $6, trying to hide the frayed cuffs under the table. My shoes were wet because my boots had a hole in the sole, and I couldn't afford to replace them until my next freelance check cleared. I looked down at my plate. Next to the silverware sat my birthday gift. They hadn't even bothered to wrap it. It was a daily planner with the title "Budgeting for Dummies" embossed on the front. Just an hour ago, my mother, Catherine, had slid it toward me with a pitying smile. "Maybe this year?" she'd said, her voice dripping with that fake concern she perfected. "You'll finally learn to live within your means, Juniper. It's painful watching you struggle like this." For years, that was the narrative. Juniper the failure. Juniper the artist who couldn't do math. Juniper, the black sheep who burned through cash while her parents, the pillars of Chicago society, looked on with disappointed grace. They had me convinced that my poverty was a character flaw. When I ate instant noodles for weeks to pay for my Adobe subscription, I thought it was my penance for being bad with money. When I shivered in my unheated Wicker Park loft, I told myself I deserved the cold because I hadn't worked hard enough to earn warmth. But looking at my father's trembling hands, the math suddenly changed. They weren't disappointed in me. They were projecting. Every lecture about fiscal responsibility, every sigh over my poor choices, every cheap gift given with a lecture, it was all a cover. They weren't teaching me a lesson. They were hiding a crime. I realized something in that silence, something that hit me harder than the hunger I usually felt. It's the trap of normalizing cruelty. When you grow up in a freezer, you don't know you're cold. You don't know that your teeth aren't supposed to chatter. You just assume that shivering is what breathing feels like. I had accepted their neglect as the cost of being their daughter. I thought the starvation was love. I thought the coldness was just the temperature of the world. But it wasn't. The world wasn't cold. They were. Grandpa Edward didn't let the silence stretch. He didn't blink. He just sat there, the iron patriarch, who had built this family's fortune from steel and grit, waiting for an answer he clearly already knew. He looked at my father, then at the Budgeting for Dummies book, and let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like a judge's gavel hitting the bench. "Well?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Catherine? Brian? She's waiting." "I'm waiting." "Where is $5 million? My mother started to stammer something about market volatility and unforeseen expenses, but Grandpa Edward didn't let her finish. He stood up, and the movement was so sharp, it felt like he'd drawn a weapon. "Brian, Catherine," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "stay exactly where you are. If you attempt to leave this property, my security team has been instructed to call the authorities. Juniper, come with me." I didn't look at my parents. I couldn't. I stood up, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, and followed him out of that freezing dining room. We walked out the front door into the Chicago winter, but for the first time all night, the cold didn't bite. It felt clean. We got into his car, a heavy, silent vehicle that smelled of leather and old tobacco. He didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He handed it to me without looking at me. "I need you to see this," he said. I unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, looping, and desperate. It was mine. It was a letter I had written 7 years ago, right after I got accepted into art school but couldn't afford the deposit. I had written to Grandpa, begging for advice, asking if he thought I was making a mistake pursuing design. I had poured my heart out, asking for a connection, not money. I never got a response, I whispered, staring at the ink. I thought you hated me. Mom told me you threw it in the trash. She said you called my dreams pathetic hobbies. Grandpa gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. And she told me you wanted nothing to do with me. She said you called me a toxic old tyrant and returned my birthday checks shredded. But she didn't just tell me that, Juniper. She intercepted this. I found it in her vanity drawer this afternoon while they were getting dressed for dinner. The realization hit me harder than the theft. They hadn't just stolen my trust fund. They had stolen my grandfather. They had manufactured a decade of silence and estrangement just to keep me away from him, to keep me from asking questions about the money. They had isolated me to rob me. He started the car. We're going to my attorney. The audit is finished. The drive was a blur of city lights and silent rage. When we arrived at the firm, a team was waiting. They laid it out on a mahogany table, the autopsy of my life. It wasn't just $3.4 million. With the interest that should have accrued, the trust was valued at $5.2 million. And then came the line items. The forensic accountant didn't use soft words. Brian has a gambling addiction, he said, sliding a sheet of red numbers toward me. Online poker? High-stakes tables in Vegas? He lost $1.4 million in 2019 alone. I looked at the next page. Catherine's boutique? I asked. A shell, the lawyer replied. She rented retail space in the Gold Coast for 4 years, stocked it with inventory she never sold, and used the business accounts to fund trips to Milan and Paris. She burned through $2 million playing shopkeeper. I sat there, looking at the spreadsheet. Every time I had eaten ramen to save $5, my father was betting thousands on a hand of cards. Every time I had cried over a past-due electric bill, my mother was flying first class to Europe on my dime. It wasn't mismanagement. It was a feeding frenzy. Grandpa Edward looked at me, his eyes full of a sorrow that terrified me. It's all gone, Juniper. The liquid assets are drained. But I am not going to let them walk away. The question is, how far do you want to take this? I looked at the numbers. I looked at the letter I had written 7 years ago. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. I want everything back, I said. Every single cent. By the time we left the law firm, my phone wasn't just buzzing, it was convulsing. I sat in the passenger seat of Grandpa Edward's car, watching the notifications stack up on the lock screen like a Tetris game from hell. You'd think that when 2 people are caught stealing $5 million from their own daughter, their first instinct would be shame. Maybe silence. Maybe a desperate scramble to apologize. But that assumes Catherine and Brian operated on a standard moral operating system. They didn't. They operated on survival and optics. The first text was from my father. It wasn't an apology. It was a threat. You think you can hijack a confused old man and turn him against his own son? We know what you're doing, Juniper. Elder abuse is a felony. Fix this before we call the police. I read it twice. The audacity was breathtaking. They had drained his accounts, isolated him for a decade, and thrown his letters in the trash. But now that he was cutting off the supply, I was the abuser. It was a masterclass in projection. Then came the barrage from my mother. Her approach wasn't legal threats, it was emotional warfare. I can't believe you would do this to us. Over money? After everything we sacrificed to give you a good name? You're destroying this family for a payout. I hope you're proud of yourself. Pick up the phone. Stop hiding behind your grandfather. He's not well, and you know it. We are your parents. You owe us loyalty, not a lawsuit. I didn't reply. I didn't block them, either. I took screenshots. Every vibration was just another line item in the case against them. Grandpa glanced over at me, his eyes on the road but his attention on my white-knuckled grip on the phone. Don't read them, he said, his voice gravelly. It's just noise. It's the sound of rats when the ship starts taking on water. It's not just texts, I said, opening Facebook. My mother hadn't waited for a private resolution. She had gone nuclear. There, at the top of her feed, posted 20 minutes ago, to her 2,000 curated friends, the society ladies, the country club board members, the people whose validation she breathed like oxygen, was a status update. It was a picture of her looking wistfully out a window, captioned with vague, poetic toxicity. The sharpest sting is not from an enemy, but from a child you poured your soul into, heartbroken by the greed and ingratitude we are facing today. Please pray for our family as we deal with those who would take advantage of the elderly for their own gain. The comments were already pouring in. Stay strong, Catherine. So sorry you're going through this, hun. Kids these days feel so entitled. She was controlling the narrative. She was painting me as the predator before I could even file the paperwork. She was willing to burn my reputation to the ground to keep her own warm. I looked at the screen, and the last remaining thread of hesitation snapped. There was no misunderstanding here. There was no "we were desperate." This was malice. This was a calculated campaign to discredit the witness to their crime. They aren't sorry, I said, my voice steady. They're just mad they got caught. I turned off the screen. I was done being the daughter who begged for scraps. If they wanted a war, I would give them one. But I wouldn't fight it on Facebook. I would fight it with subpoenas. The wind off Lake Michigan rattled the single-pane windows of my Wicker Park loft, a sound I usually associated with freezing nights and high heating bills. But tonight, the cold felt different. It felt like clarity. I sat at my kitchen table, which was actually just a door I'd found in an alley propped up on two sawhorses. Across from me sat Courtney, my roommate. She's a second-year law student with a caffeine addiction and a shark's instinct for blood in the water. When I told her what happened, she didn't offer me tea or a hug. She opened her laptop. "We need to pull your full credit report," she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Not the free summary you get from your banking app. The deep dive. If they drained the trust, Juniper, they didn't stop there. Narcissists don't stop until the well is dry, and then they start digging for mud." I wanted to believe she was wrong. I wanted to believe that even Catherine and Brian had limits. That stealing $5 million was the ceiling of their depravity. But as the report loaded, spinning on the screen, I remembered the Budgeting for Dummies planner. I remembered my father's lecture about building a credit history. The page refreshed, and the air left the room. "What is Winnetka Ventures LLC?" Courtney asked, pointing to a line item. "I don't know," I said. "I've never heard of it." "Well," she said, her voice tight, "according to this, you're the primary guarantor on a $200,000 business line of credit opened in 2018, and it's maxed out." She scrolled down. There was more. "A secondary mortgage on the Lake Geneva house, taken out in my name. 3 high-limit credit cards, all maxed, all with billing addresses routed to a P.O. box in Evanstown I didn't know existed. They hadn't just robbed me of my inheritance. They had actively harvested my identity. When their own credit crashed from the gambling and the failed boutiques, they used my clean slate to keep the lights on at the estate. Every time they told me I was bad with money, they were actively ruining my financial future to buy themselves more time. They forged your signature," Courtney said, looking at a digital copy of a loan application. "This isn't just theft, Juniper. This is federal wire fraud. This is identity theft. This is 20 years in prison." But the numbers weren't the worst part. Courtney kept digging. She logged into a shared family cloud account I hadn't accessed since high school, a digital graveyard of family photos and automated backups. She was looking for recent syncs. "Juniper," she said, and this time, she didn't look at the screen. She looked at me. "Check the downloads folder." I leaned in. There was a PDF downloaded 3 hours ago. A travel itinerary. Passenger, Brian Hart. Passenger, Catherine Hart. Flight. U.A. 1192. Destination. Owen Roberts. International Airport, Grand Cayman. Type. One way. Departure. Thursday. 6 in the morning. I looked at the date on my phone. Thursday was the day after tomorrow. They weren't planning to face the music. They weren't planning to negotiate with Grandpa or apologize to me. They were liquidating what little cash they had left, hopping a flight to a non-extradition perception haven, and leaving me behind to deal with the creditors, the IRS, and the wreckage of the loans they took out in my name. They were going to leave me with millions in debt and run. Courtney slammed her laptop shut. "They're runners," she said. "If they get on that plane, you never see a dime. And you might end up liable for the fraud if we don't prove it was them before they vanish." I stood up. The loft didn't feel cold anymore. I felt a strange, vibrating heat in my chest. It was the death of the last tiny stupid part of me that still wanted them to be my parents. "They aren't going to the Caymans," I said, grabbing my coat. "They aren't going anywhere." O'Hare International Terminal at 5 in the morning creates a specific kind of sensory deprivation. The air is recycled, the light is artificial, and the faces are gray. It's the perfect backdrop for the end of an illusion. We found them near the first-class check-in counter. They weren't hard to spot. Even on the run, Catherine and Brian were committed to the aesthetic. My mother was wearing a camel cashmere coat and oversized sunglasses, trying to look like a celebrity avoiding paparazzi, rather than a fugitive avoiding a felony indictment. My father was arguing with the gate agent, his voice rising in that familiar, entitled cadence I had spent my childhood shrinking away from. "I am a platinum member," he was saying, slamming his hand on the counter. "I demand you process these bags." Grandpa Edward didn't run. He walked with the terrifying, rhythmic thud of a man who owns the ground he steps on. He stopped 10 feet behind them. "Brian," he said. The word wasn't loud, but it cut through the terminal noise like a knife through silk. My father spun around. The blood didn't just drain from his face, it vanished. For a second, I saw the reflex kick in the instinct to bluster, to intimidate, to act the part of the offended patriarch. He opened his mouth to shout, to demand respect, to play the role he had played for 26 years. But then he saw the two men standing behind Grandpa. Not police, not yet, federal marshals. The bluster died in his throat. He deflated. It was physical, like watching a balloon lose its air. His shoulders slumped, his chest caved, and the sneer fell off his face, leaving behind something naked and pathetic. Catherine turned slowly. She saw me standing there, holding the file Courtney had compiled. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked terrified. And then, she did the one thing I promised myself I wouldn't fall for. She started to cry. "Juniper," she sobbed, reaching out a hand that was trembling violently. "Please. We were scared. We were going to fix it. I'm your mother. You can't let them take us. You can't." I looked at her. I really looked at her. For my entire life, I had been terrified of these people. I had thought they were giants. I thought their judgment was the final word on my worth. I thought their coldness was a sign of their superiority, that they operated on a level of sophistication I couldn't reach. But standing there under the fluorescent lights, I realized it was all a costume. It's the illusion of power of the empty wallet. We confuse money with character. We mistake the ability to buy things with the ability to be someone. My parents had built an entire identity out of things they didn't own. Their confidence, their arrogance, their standards, it was all rented. It was a persona financed by theft. Without the trust fund, without the credit lines stolen in my name, without the Winnetka estate they were fleeing, they weren't powerful. They weren't intimidating. They were just two middle-aged con artists, with bad credit and nowhere to go. They had no internal value. They were hollow shells that echoed with the sound of other people's money. "You aren't my mother," I said, my voice flat. "You're an identity thief." Brian stepped forward, his eyes darting around the terminal. "Juniper, listen. We can work this out. The gambling, it was a system. I can win it back. I just need time. Don't do this. Don't destroy your family." "I didn't destroy this family," I said. "I audited it." The marshal stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart, we have a warrant for the seizure of your passports pending an investigation into federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You're not getting on that plane." I watched as the handcuffs clicked. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a correction. The universe was finally balancing the books. Catherine screamed as they led her away, a high, thin sound that made people look up from their phones. Brian just looked at the floor, defeated by the math he could no longer manipulate. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel happy. I felt light. The weight of their expectations, their judgment, Their love, it stayed there on the terminal floor, abandoned like luggage they couldn't afford to check. The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. I sat across from them one last time, not in a dining room, but in a conference room that smelled of toner and finality. They didn't look like socialites anymore. They looked like what they were, two people who had gambled their humanity and lost. The deal was simple. They signed over everything: the Winnetka estate, the Lake Geneva vacation home, the jewelry, the remaining cars, or I pressed charges for the identity theft and wire fraud. It was a choice between poverty and prison. They chose poverty. I watched them sign. Catherine's hand shook so badly the pen tore through the paper. Brian didn't look up. He just signed his name, surrendering the last of his rented dignity. They walked out of that room with 3 suitcases of clothes and a check for $2,000, enough for a deposit on a studio apartment and a month of ramen. The irony wasn't lost on me. I finally gave them a budget they had to live by. I didn't keep the Winnetka house. I couldn't. The walls held too much silence. I sold it to a developer who planned to gut it, and I felt a vicious satisfaction in knowing that the architect of coldness was being dismantled down to the studs. I paid off my student loans. I paid off the credit cards they had maxed out in my name. I cleared the debt, the interest, and the shame. For the first time in my adult life, I looked at a bank balance and saw freedom instead of fear. But I didn't stop there. Because destroying them was just the demolition. I needed to build something on the empty lot. It's called the justice of the sower. There is a difference between the justice of punishment, which looks backward, and the justice of growth, which looks forward. Taking their money was necessary, but it wasn't the victory. The victory was deciding that the money wouldn't be a weapon anymore, it would be a tool. I established the Phoenix Grant. It's a foundation dedicated to creatives, designers, painters, writers who are trapped in financial abuse or crushing debt. I used the millions recovered from the sale of the estate to fund it. Every year, I select 20 artists and pay off their loans. I give them the runway I never had. I give them the warmth I was denied. I'm sitting in my new living room now. It's not a mansion, it's a bungalow with big windows and a heating system that actually works. On the table in front of me is a stack of applications for the first round of grants. I'm reading a letter from a girl in Ohio who is eating instant noodles to pay for paint supplies. I pick up my pen. I'm going to change her life today. Not because I want her gratitude, but because I know exactly how cold it is in her kitchen, and I have the power to turn on the heat. My parents are gone. I don't know where they are, and I don't check. They are a chapter I ripped out of the book. But this legacy of helping people climb out of the hole, this is the rest of the story. If you've ever had to build yourself back up from zero because the people who were supposed to protect you failed, tap that subscribe button. We're building a new family here.